Sunday dinner was perfect, as always. I had woken up at 5 in the morning to prepare everything, every detail thought out with care. Then my husband said those words in front of everyone. She does nothing with her life. The silence that followed was deafening, and the aroma of the roast I had made with so much love suddenly turned bitter in my mouth. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, right there at my own dinner table, in front of everyone who mattered most to me in this world. She doesn't do anything with her life. My husband's voice carried across the Sunday roast I'd been preparing since dawn, the gravy I'd stirred to perfection, the rolls I'd kneaded with these same hands he was dismissing as worthless. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my daughter Sarah's fork clatter against her plate. My son Mike shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The grandkids, bless their hearts, kept eating like nothing had happened. But the adults all knew something had just broken that couldn't be fixed with an apology. I sat there staring at the centerpiece I'd arranged this morning, those yellow daisies I'd picked from what used to be my mother's garden, and I felt something die inside me. 30 years of marriage, 30 years of making sure his shirts were pressed, his coffee was ready, his dinner was waiting, 30 years of birthday parties planned, scraped knees kissed, homework supervised, Christmas mornings orchestrated. 30 years of being the invisible foundation that held this family together. And this is what it added up to. Nothing. The thing is, I'd been feeling it for months before he said it out loud. That restlessness, that sense that everyone around me was living their lives while I was just existing in the margins of theirs. Sarah had her law practice, making partner at 35. Mike had his construction business, buying his second truck last spring. Even the grandkids had their soccer teams and piano lessons and art classes. Everyone had something that was theirs. Everyone except me. But I never said anything because what was I supposed to say? That I felt invisible, that I felt like a ghost in my own life. That sometimes I'd stand in the grocery store and wonder what would happen if I just walked out of that automatic door and never came back. Would anyone even notice I was gone, or would they just wonder who was going to make dinner? Tom didn't even look at me after he said it, just kept cutting his roast like he'd commented on the weather. But I saw Sarah glance at me with what looked like pity, and that was almost worse than her father's words. My own daughter looking at me like I was some pathetic creature who'd wasted her life. Maybe I had. Maybe that's exactly what I'd done. After dinner, while I was scraping plates and loading the dishwasher, I heard them in the living room. Talking about me like I wasn't in the next room. Sarah saying something about how I needed hobbies, and Mike agreeing that maybe I should get out more. Like I was some elderly aunt they were discussing, instead of the woman who'd raised them, who'd sacrificed her own dreams so they could chase theirs. I remember standing at that kitchen sink, my hands deep in soapy water, and thinking about my friend Janet from high school. She'd become a nurse, traveled to 3 different states for her job, sent me Christmas cards with pictures of mountains and beaches I'd never see. Or my college roommate Linda, who'd started her own catering business at 50 and was now running food trucks in 4 cities. What had I done? I'd gotten married at 28 and disappeared. That night, after Tom was snoring beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to remember the last time I'd done something just for me, not for the family, not for the house, not because it needed doing, just for me. I couldn't think of a single thing, not one. The next morning, Tom acted like nothing had happened, made his usual jokes about the coffee being too strong, complained about the news, kissed my cheek on his way out the door like he'd done every morning for 3 decades. But something had shifted. I could feel it in my chest, like a door had opened that I'd never even known was there. I found myself walking through the house differently, looking at things with new eyes. The photo albums full of family vacations where I was always behind the camera. The walls covered with the kids' achievements, Tom's awards from work, everyone's accomplishments except mine. Even the furniture we'd chosen together somehow felt like it belonged to someone else. like I was just the caretaker of other people's lives. 3 days later, I was cleaning out the attic, something I'd been putting off for months. We were getting new insulation installed, and Tom had asked me to clear out the space. As I was moving boxes and sorting through decades of accumulated family history, my hand touched something I'd forgotten was up there. A small wooden chest that had belonged to my great Aunt Rose. I hadn't thought about Aunt Rose in years. She died when I was 12, but I remembered her as this fascinating woman who lived alone in a big house downtown and wore jewelry that caught the light and always smelled like vanilla and something exotic. My mother used to say Rose was eccentric, which I later understood meant she'd never married and had run some kind of business back when women weren't supposed to do things like that. The chest was locked, but the wood was old and the latch gave way easily. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at my touch, were letters, dozens of them, tied with ribbons that had faded from red to pink. The return addresses were all from Rose, but they were addressed to someone named Margaret Collins. It took me a moment to realize that had been my grandmother's maiden name before she married my grandfather. The first letter I opened was dated 1973. Rose's handwriting was bold and confident, nothing like the careful script they'd taught us in school. "Dearest Maggie," it began, "the shop is doing better than I ever imagined. We're booked solid through Christmas, and I've had to hire 2 more seamstresses just to keep up with demand. I never dreamed that little dress shop would turn into something like this." Dress shop. I sat back on my heels in that dusty attic and tried to process this information. Aunt Rose had owned a business, a successful one apparently, and I'd never known. My mother had never mentioned it. Rose was just the eccentric aunt who died before I was old enough to ask the right questions. I kept reading, letter after letter describing business challenges, triumphs, setbacks, and victories. Rose writing about negotiations with suppliers, about designing window displays, about the satisfaction of helping women find clothes that made them feel beautiful. She wrote about attending trade shows, about expanding into accessories, about the thrill of seeing her work featured in the local newspaper's fashion section. But it was the last letter that stopped my heart. Dated just 3 months before Rose died, it was shorter than the others. "Maggie," it said, "I know you think I wasted my life because I never married, never had children. But I want you to know I lived exactly the life I chose. I built something with these hands that mattered. I supported myself, employed other women, contributed to this community. I may not have raised children, but I raised up other women. I may not have a husband, but I have a legacy. Don't let anyone tell you that. The only way to matter is to disappear into someone else's life." I sat in that attic with tears streaming down my face, holding a letter from a woman who'd been dead for nearly 50 years, and felt like she was speaking directly to me across all that time. Like she'd known somehow that someday her grandniece would be sitting in her own house, invisible in her own life, wondering if she'd ever mattered to anyone. But there was more. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in oilcloth, was a manila envelope marked "Property Documents." Inside were papers I couldn't entirely understand, but one thing was clear. Rose had owned land, a small plot about 20 miles outside town, near the old highway. According to these papers, it had passed to my grandmother when Rose died, then to my mother, and now, apparently, to me. I'd inherited land I'd never known existed from a woman whose true life I'd never known either. Land that was mine, not ours, not the family's, mine. That afternoon, I drove out to find it. The address on the deed led me down a winding country road I'd driven past hundreds of times but never really noticed. When I found the right mailbox number, I pulled over and walked through an opening in a chain-link fence that had seen better days. It wasn't much. Maybe 2 acres of overgrown grass and weeds, with an old well pump and the remains of what might have been a small barn. But standing there in the middle of all that wildness, with the afternoon sun warm on my face and the sound of nothing but wind and birds, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten what to call it. Freedom. I stayed until the sun started to set, just walking around what was apparently my property, imagining what it could become, what I could make it become. For the first time in decades, I was thinking about something that was entirely mine to dream about. When I got home, Tom was irritated that dinner wasn't ready. He made some comment about me running around when there was work to be done at home. I almost told him about the land, about the letters, about Aunt Rose. Almost. But something stopped me. Some instinct told me to keep this discovery to myself, at least for now. That night, I spread the letters out on the kitchen table, after Tom went to bed and read every single one again. Rose wrote about failures, too, about months when the shop barely broke even, about customers who complained, about suppliers who cheated her. But she also wrote about the satisfaction of solving problems, of creating something beautiful, of being responsible for her own success or failure. The hardest part, she wrote in one letter, isn't the work itself. It's believing you deserve to take up space in the world. It's believing your dreams matter as much as everyone else's. It's believing you're worth the risk. Worth the risk. I must have read that phrase 20 times before I finally folded the letters and put them away. Worth the risk. When was the last time I'd taken a risk? When was the last time I'd believed I was worth one? The next few days passed in a strange kind of suspension. I went through my usual routines, but everything felt different. I found myself noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way Tom never asked me how my day had been, just launched into complaints about his own. The way Sarah called only when she needed something, a babysitter or a recipe, or someone to listen to her work problems. The way Mike assumed I'd always be available to watch the grandkids, but never thought to ask if I had plans of my own. I started paying attention to myself too, to the way I automatically deferred to everyone else's preferences, to the way I apologized for things that weren't my fault, to the way I made myself smaller and quieter whenever anyone else wanted to take up more space. A week after finding the letters, I drove back out to the property. This time, I brought a notebook and started making lists. What would need to be cleared? What the soil might be good for? Whether the old well was still functional? I didn't know why I was doing it, didn't have any concrete plans. I just knew I needed to do something with this piece of earth that was mine. On the drive home, I stopped at the library and checked out books on gardening, on small-scale farming, on starting businesses. The librarian, a woman about my age named Carol, who I'd seen around town for years but never really talked to, noticed my selections. "Thinking about growing your own vegetables?" she asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested she understood this was about more than tomatoes. "Maybe," I said. "I recently came into some property, just trying to figure out what to do with it." "Good for you," she said, and the way she said it made me feel like I'd accomplished something significant. It's never too late to start something new. Never too late. I carried those words home with me, like a talisman. That Sunday, exactly 2 weeks after the dinner that changed everything, I made my usual roast, set the table with the good dishes, lit the candles I'd been saving for special occasions. But this time, when we all gathered around the table, I looked at each face differently. Not as the people I existed to serve, but as the people who would need to learn to see me as I was learning to see myself. Tom made his usual comment about the meal being good, but he said it like he was doing me a favor by noticing. Sarah complained about work stress while I cleared the plates. Mike talked about a fishing trip he was planning with his buddies, never thinking to ask if I might want to do something like that too. But this time, instead of just listening and nodding and disappearing into the kitchen, I cleared my throat. "I have something to tell you all," I said. The conversation stopped. They looked at me with expressions of mild curiosity, mixed with impatience, like I was interrupting something important instead of finally joining it. "I've inherited some property," I said, "from my great-aunt Rose, and I'm thinking about doing something with it." The silence that followed was different from the one 2 weeks ago. This wasn't the silence of shock or embarrassment. This was the silence of people trying to figure out if they needed to pay attention. "What kind of property?" Tom asked, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice already. "A couple of acres outside town. Good soil. I'm thinking about farming it." The laughter started with Sarah. Not mean laughter, but the kind you give a child who's announced they want to be an astronaut. "Mom, you don't know anything about farming." "I can learn," I said, and was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "At your age," Tom said, shaking his head. "What's gotten into you lately?" But Mike, my quiet younger son who usually let everyone else do the talking, leaned forward. "What kind of farming, Mom?" And for the first time in longer than I could remember, someone was asking me about something that was mine. Something I wanted to do, something I was choosing. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I'm going to find out." After everyone left that night, Tom and I were alone in the kitchen. He was reading the paper while I finished cleaning up, and I could feel his disapproval like a cloud hanging over us. "This is about what I said 2 weeks ago, isn't it?" he finally said without looking up from the sports section. I stopped wiping the counter and really looked at my husband. This man I'd built my entire adult life around. This man who'd just dismissed 30 years of my devotion as nothing and was now annoyed that I might want something of my own. "Yes," I said. "It is." He folded the paper and looked at me with an expression I'd seen before when the kids had disappointed him. "Helen, you're 60 years old. You can't just decide to become a farmer because your feelings got hurt." "Watch me," I said. And I realized as the words left my mouth that I meant them. For the first time in my marriage, in my adult life maybe, I meant them completely. The next morning, Tom left for work without his usual kiss goodbye. He'd spent the evening making pointed comments about crazy ideas and women your age making fools of themselves. But I'd stopped listening after the third or fourth jab. Instead, I'd spent the time reading more of Rose's letters, particularly the ones where she wrote about people who tried to discourage her. "Don't let their fear become your ceiling," she'd written to my grandmother. "Small minds always try to make big dreams seem impossible." I was still thinking about that phrase when I called the county extension office. The woman who answered sounded young and enthusiastic, nothing like what I'd expected from a government office. "You want to start farming at 60?" she said, and I braced myself for another lecture about realistic expectations. Instead, she laughed with what sounded like delight. "That's fantastic. Some of our most successful farmers didn't start until their second careers. Can you come in this afternoon? I'd love to talk to you about soil testing and crop options." Her name was Maria Santos, and she was maybe 35 with dirt under her fingernails and the kind of confidence I envied. When I told her about the property, she pulled out maps and started asking questions I hadn't even thought of. Drainage, sun exposure, previous crop history, market demands in our area. "The beautiful thing about your situation," she said, spreading out charts and pamphlets across her desk, "is that you don't need to feed a family on this income right away. You can experiment, try different crops, find your niche." My niche. I'd never thought about having a niche before. "What are you drawn to?" she asked. "Vegetables, flowers, herbs?" I thought about my kitchen windowsill, where I'd always kept a few pots of basil and oregano, about how the smell of fresh herbs could transform a simple dish into something special, about how I'd always wished I could grow more, but never had the space or permission. "Herbs, maybe," I said tentatively, "and vegetables. I've always wanted a real garden." Maria's eyes lit up. "There's a huge market for fresh organic herbs around here," The restaurants downtown are always looking for local suppliers, and with the farmers market growing every year, she pulled out another sheet of paper. Let me give you some names, people you should talk to. I drove home with a folder full of information and a feeling I couldn't quite name. Purpose, maybe. Direction. For the first time in years, I had homework that was actually mine. That evening, while Tom watched television and pointedly ignored my papers spread across the kitchen table, I started making lists. Crops to research, people to call, equipment I might need, money I would have to spend. That last one made my stomach tighten. I'd never made a major financial decision without Tom's input. Hell, I'd never made a major financial decision, period. But when I thought about the money in our savings account, the account where my name appeared second after Tom's, I realized I'd contributed to it too. Not with a paycheck, but with 30 years of unpaid labor that had allowed Tom to work overtime, travel for business, focus entirely on his career without worrying about anything at home. I'd earned the right to invest in myself. The next few days fell into a new rhythm. Tom would leave for work, still radiating disapproval, and I would drive out to the property with my notebook and measuring tape. I walked every inch of those 2 acres, getting familiar with the slope of the land, the wet spots, the areas that got the most sun. On Thursday, I was kneeling in what I thought might become the herb garden, pulling up weeds and trying to assess the soil quality, when I heard a car door slam. I looked up to see a woman about my age walking toward me with a thermos in one hand and what looked like homemade cookies in the other. "You must be the new owner," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Betty Crawford. I live just down the road." Betty had the kind of weathered hands that spoke of years of outdoor work, and her smile was genuine. She poured coffee from her thermos into 2 cups, and we sat on the tailgate of my car, eating cookies and talking about the land. "Rose used to grow the most beautiful flowers here," Betty said, gesturing toward the overgrown area near the old barn. "Dahlias the size of dinner plates. She'd bring bouquets to anyone who was sick or celebrating. Made this whole area more beautiful just by being here." "You knew my great-aunt?" "Oh, honey, everyone knew Rose. She was something special. Independent as the day is long, but generous too. When my husband died 15 years ago, she showed up at my door every week for months with soup and flowers and a listening ear." Betty studied my face. "You have her eyes, you know. That same determined look she got when she'd set her mind to something." That afternoon, Betty walked me around the property and pointed out things I'd missed. The remnants of Rose's flower beds, the old compost pile that had turned into the richest soil I'd ever seen, the natural windbreak created by a line of oak trees. "This land wants to grow things," she said. "Rose always said it just needed someone who understood how to listen to it." When I got home that evening, Tom was already in his chair with his dinner on a TV tray, even though I'd left a casserole in the refrigerator with clear reheating instructions. "Where have you been all day?" he asked without looking away from the news. "At the property, learning about the soil, talking to neighbors." "You missed 3 phone calls. Sarah needed you to pick up the kids from school because her meeting ran late, and Mike wanted to know if you could watch little Emma tomorrow." Something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. There was satisfaction there, like he'd been keeping score, like he was pleased I'd failed at something. "Did you tell them I wasn't available?" "I told them you were off playing farmer." The casual cruelty of it hit me like a slap. Playing farmer. Like my dreams were a child's game that would eventually be abandoned when real life demanded my attention. "I wasn't playing anything," I said quietly. "I was working." "Working?" He finally looked at me, and his expression was both amused and condescending. "Helen, you pulled some weeds and talked to a neighbor. That's not work." "Then what do you call what I've been doing for 30 years? The question hung in the air between us. Tom's mouth opened and closed like he was trying to find words that wouldn't get him in more trouble than he was already in. "That's different," he finally said. "That's family. And this is mine." I went upstairs and called Sarah back. "When?" she answered. She sounded harried and slightly annoyed. "Mom, where were you? I really needed you today." "I was at my property, working on my farming project." "Your what?" The dismissal in her voice was so automatic, I wondered if she'd learned it from her father. "Mom, you can't just disappear when we need you. I have responsibilities." "So do I said, and the words felt foreign in my mouth. "I have responsibilities to myself now, too." "This is ridiculous. You're acting like a teenager instead of a grandmother." "I'm acting like a person who deserves to have her own life." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had shifted from annoyed to something that sounded almost like concern. "Mom, are you having some kind of breakdown? Because if you are, we can get you help." Help. Like wanting something for myself was a mental illness that needed to be cured. "I'm fine, Sarah. Better than fine. I'm finally waking up." "Dad's worried about you. Dad's worried about losing his unpaid housekeeper." Another silence, then Sarah's voice, colder now. "That's not fair. Isn't it?" After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and wondered, when my own family had started treating me like an employee instead of a person, when my dreams had become inconveniences to be managed, when my value had been reduced to my availability. The next morning, I woke up before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I made Tom's coffee and breakfast, packed his lunch, and kissed him goodbye just like always. But after his car disappeared down the street, I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote out a check for $5,000 to myself from our joint savings account. My hands shook as I signed it, but I didn't hesitate. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. At the bank, the teller looked at the check twice before processing it. "Starting your own account, Mrs. Patterson?" "Yes," I said, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff. "I am." With my new account established and a debit card that had only my name on it, I drove to the feed store Maria had recommended. The place smelled like hay and fertilizer and possibility. The man behind the counter, probably in his 70s, with hands that looked like they'd grown everything worth growing, listened to my plans with the kind of attention I hadn't received from anyone in my family in years. "You're starting with herbs and vegetables?" he asked, pulling out order forms. "Smart choice. Good margins, steady demand. You'll want to start your seeds indoors next month if you're planning to plant in early spring." We spent an hour going through catalogs, selecting varieties that would grow well in our climate and soil conditions. Seeds for basil, oregano, thyme, and rosemary. Heirloom. Tomatoes and peppers. Lettuce and spinach for early season crops. Each packet he handed me felt like a promise I was making to myself. "You'll need some basic tools," he said, walking me through the greenhouse section. "Nothing fancy to start. Good soil, basic hand tools, maybe a small tiller for the larger beds." By the time I left, I'd spent nearly $2,000 on seeds, tools, and soil amendments. The back of my car was loaded with bags of compost and fertilizer, and I had delivery scheduled for a small greenhouse kit that would arrive the following week. I drove home feeling like I'd just signed a contract with my future self. There was no backing out now. I'd invested too much, committed too much, risked too much to quit when things got difficult. Tom's car was in the driveway when I pulled in. He never came home early unless something was wrong. I found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table with papers spread out in front of him. Bank statements. "What the hell is this, Helen?" His voice was quiet, but I could hear the anger underneath. I looked at the statements and saw the highlighted withdrawals, the check to myself, the purchases at the feed store. "It's my investment in our future," I said, hanging my car keys on the hook by the door. $5,000? Without even discussing it with me? Like you discussed calling me worthless with me? That's not the same thing, isn't it? You made a decision about my value without consulting me. I made a decision about my future without consulting you. Tom stood up, and for a moment, I thought he might yell. Instead, he just looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. "This isn't you, Helen. This isn't who you are. Maybe it is, and you just never bothered to find out." That weekend, Mike came over to help Tom fix the back porch steps, and I could hear them talking while I organized my seeds in the basement. Their voices carried through the heating ducts, and it was clear they thought I couldn't hear them. "She's lost her mind," Tom was saying, "spending money we don't have on some crazy farming scheme." "Maybe she just needs to feel useful," Mike said, and I was surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "You know, since we all grew up and moved out. She is useful. She takes care of the house, takes care of me. What more does she need?" "I don't know, Dad. Maybe she needs something that's hers." "Everything here is hers. This is her home. But it's not her life." The conversation stopped after that, and I wondered if Mike had said something that made Tom think, or if Tom had just gotten angry and changed the subject. That evening, after Mike left, Tom found me in the basement labeling seed packets and organizing them by planting dates. "Helen," he said, sitting down on the old couch we'd relegated to the basement years ago, "can we talk?" I looked up from my seeds. His voice was different, not angry or dismissive, almost pleading. "I don't understand what's happening," he said. "We've been married 30 years. We've been happy." "You've been happy," I corrected. "I've been invisible." "That's not true." "When was the last time you asked me what I wanted, Tom? Not what I wanted for dinner or what I wanted to watch on television. What I wanted for my life." He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. Sat there for a long moment staring at his hands. "I thought you wanted this," he finally said. "This life we built together. I wanted to matter, to you, to the kids, to myself, but somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person and became a function. You matter to me." "As what? Your housekeeper? Your cook? The person who makes sure your life runs smoothly while you never have to think about mine?" The silence stretched between us. Outside, I could hear the first spring rain starting to fall on the basement windows. "What do you want from me, Helen?" "I want you to see me. Not as what I do for you, but as who I am, who I could become." "And if I can't?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I looked at this man I'd loved for 30 years, this man who'd fathered my children and shared my bed and never once asked me what I dreamed about. "Then I'll see myself," I said, "with or without you." That night, I lay awake listening to Tom's breathing and thinking about the seeds waiting in labeled packets downstairs. In a few weeks, I'd plant them in the greenhouse. In a few months, they'd be growing in soil I'd prepared with my own hands. By summer, I'd have something to harvest, something I'd created from nothing but dirt and water and determination. For the first time in 30 years, I was excited about tomorrow, terrified, but excited. And for the first time in my marriage, I was pretty sure I could survive without Tom's approval. The question was whether he could survive without mine. Spring came early that year, like the earth itself was eager to help me start over. I spent March mornings in my new greenhouse, watching tiny green shoots push through the soil in their neat rows of seedling trays. Each emergence felt like a small miracle, proof that I could nurture something into existence. Tom had stopped commenting on my daily trips to the property, though I caught him sometimes standing at the kitchen window, watching me load tools into the car. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. Not anger anymore, but not acceptance either. More like he was watching a stranger who happened to be wearing his wife's face. The real test came when Sarah called with what she obviously considered devastating news. "Mom, I talked to Dr. Richardson about your recent behavior changes," she said without preamble. "He thinks you might be experiencing some kind of hormonal imbalance. Postmenopausal women sometimes develop irrational fixations." I was kneeling in what would become my herb garden, pulling up the last of the winter. Weeds when she called. The soil was still cold but workable, and I'd spent the morning marking out beds with string and wooden stakes. "Irrational fixations," I repeated, sitting back on my heels. "Is that what we're calling dreams now?" "Mom, you've spent almost $8,000 on gardening supplies. Dad showed me the bank statements. $8,000. Had it really been that much? I thought about the greenhouse, the tools, the soil amendments, the irrigation system I'd had installed last week. The small tractor I'd bought, used from a farmer whose arthritis had forced him to downsize. It's an investment, Sarah." "In what? You don't know anything about farming." "I'm learning." "At 60 years old. Why does everyone keep mentioning my age like it's a disease?" Sarah sighed, and I could picture her in her downtown office, probably checking her watch and calculating how much billable time this family crisis was costing her. "Because it's impractical, Mom. Because even if you could make this work, which is unlikely, you'd be starting a business when most people are thinking about retirement. Most people haven't spent 30 years in retirement from their own lives. What's that supposed to mean? It means I've been retired from being myself for so long, I forgot who that person was. This isn't a midlife crisis, Sarah. This is me finally waking up." After I hung up, I stood in the middle of my future garden and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, complete solitude without loneliness. Just me and the earth and the possibility of creating something that hadn't existed before. That afternoon, Betty Crawford stopped by with a thermos of coffee and a manila envelope that looked like it had been sitting in a drawer for decades. "I found these when I was cleaning out my attic," she said, handing me the envelope. "Pictures of Rose's garden from back in the day. Thought you might like to see what this place looked like when it was thriving." The photographs were faded, but clear enough to take my breath away. Rose's garden had been spectacular. Neat rows of vegetables bordered by explosions of flowers. A small greenhouse that must have been where mine now stood. And in several pictures, Rose herself, usually wearing overalls and a wide-brimmed hat, her face lit up with the kind of satisfaction I was just beginning to understand. "She was beautiful," I said, studying a close-up of Rose kneeling beside a prize-winning tomato plant. "Inside and out," Betty agreed. "But you know what I remember most about her? She never apologized for taking up space, never made herself smaller to make other people more comfortable. That was rare in a woman back then. It's still rare now." Betty looked at me with sharp eyes. "You're fighting for it, though. I can see it in the way you carry yourself out here, different from how you look in town." She was right. Out here, I stood straighter, spoke louder, took up more physical space, without thinking about whether I was in someone's way. "My family thinks I've lost my mind," I said. "Maybe you have. Maybe you've lost the mind that told you to be small and quiet and grateful for whatever scraps of attention people threw your way." Betty poured coffee into 2 cups and handed me one. "Sometimes losing your mind is the first step to finding your soul." That evening, I was transplanting seedlings when I heard a car door. I looked up expecting to see Betty's old pickup, but instead found myself staring at my son, Mike. He was walking toward me with his hands in his pockets and an expression I recognized from when he was little and had something difficult to say. "Hey, Mom." "Hey, yourself," What brings you out here? He looked around at the greenhouse, the marked garden beds, the small tractor parked beside the old barn. Dad asked me to come talk to you. About what? About this. He gestured at everything I'd built. He's worried you're going to bankrupt them chasing some impossible dream. I set down my trowel and really looked at my younger son. Mike had always been the quiet one, the peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts instead of confronting them. What do you think, Mike? Not what your father thinks. What do you think? He was quiet for a long moment, walking over to examine the greenhouse. Through the clear walls, you could see hundreds of seedlings in various stages of growth. I think you look happy, he said finally. Happier than I've seen you in years. But Dad's scared. He lost his job last week. The words hit me like a physical blow. Tom had lost his job and hadn't told me. 30 years of marriage, and my husband couldn't trust me with his most fundamental fear. When? Tuesday. They're downsizing the whole department. 23 years with the company, and they gave him a severance package and a handshake. I thought about Tom's behavior over the past week. The extra hours watching television. The way he'd been picking at his food. The careful way he'd been avoiding eye contact when I talked about the farm. Why didn't he tell me? Mike shrugged uncomfortably. You know, Dad, he's not good at admitting when he needs help. And he thinks I am? He thinks you're spending money you don't have on a business that might not work while he's unemployed at 62. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Tom would struggle to find another job at his age. Our savings, already depleted by my investments, wouldn't last long if we had no income. And here I was, playing farmer while our financial security crumbled. I should come home, I said, but even as I said it, something in me rebelled against the words. Should you? I looked at Mike in surprise. You think I should keep doing this, even now? I think you should do what makes you feel alive. But I also think you and Dad need to have an honest conversation about what's really going on. That night, I drove home rehearsing what I would say to Tom. How I would apologize for not being there when he needed me. How I would offer to scale, back my plans, maybe sell some of the equipment, focus on being supportive during his job search. But when I walked into the house, I found Tom in the kitchen with papers spread across the table. Not job applications or unemployment forms, bank statements, financial records, a calculator. We need to talk, he said without looking up. Mike told me about your job. Did he? Tom's voice was flat, defeated. Did he also tell you that we're going to lose the house if we don't find another source of income in the next 6 months? I sat down across from him and looked at the numbers he'd been calculating. They were worse than I'd imagined. Without his salary, we could manage maybe 4 months on savings. After that, we'd have to start borrowing against the house. I can get a job, I said. Retail, office work, something. At 60? Doing what? You haven't worked outside this house in 30 years. The dismissal in his voice stung, but underneath it, I heard something else. Fear. Raw, desperate fear. There's another option, I said quietly. Tom looked up from his papers. What option? The farm. It could be our income. Helen, you planted some seeds in a greenhouse. That's not a business. Not yet, but it could be. I got up and went to the folder where I'd been keeping all of Maria's information. Market research, crop budgets, business plans for small farms. I spread them out next to Tom's financial calculations. Look at these numbers, I said. Really look at them. Tom examined the papers with the careful attention he'd once given to engineering reports. I watched his expression change as he began to understand what I'd been learning. These profit margins, he said slowly, are they realistic? According to Maria, yes, for specialty crops sold directly to consumers and restaurants. you'd need to scale up significantly. I know. It would be a huge risk. So is you finding another job at 62. We sat, in silence, both staring at numbers that represented two very different futures. One where we played it safe and probably lost everything anyway. Another where we bet everything on something that might not work, but could change our lives completely. I don't know anything about farming, Tom said finally. Neither did I 6 months ago. If we do this, we do it together, as partners. I looked at my husband across 30 years of marriage and saw him clearly for the first time in months. Not the man who dismissed my dreams, but the man who was scared of losing everything he'd worked for. Not the person who'd made me feel invisible, but someone who was discovering he might be invisible too. Partners, I agreed. The next 3 months passed in a blur of 18-hour days and steep learning curves. Tom threw himself into the business side of farming with the same intensity he'd once brought to engineering projects. He negotiated with suppliers, researched markets, built relationships with local restaurants and farmers market managers. I focused on production, working with Maria to expand our growing operation and perfect our techniques. We converted half the basement into a seed-starting facility, expanded the garden beds to cover most of the 2 acres, installed a proper irrigation system and storage facilities. The work was backbreaking and exhilarating. I'd fall into bed each night with dirt under my fingernails and muscles I'd forgotten I had aching in protest. But I'd also fall asleep with a satisfaction I'd never experienced from any household chore. Sarah visited once during this period, arriving on a Saturday morning when Tom and I were transplanting tomato seedlings. She stood at the edge of the garden in her designer shoes and carefully pressed pants, looking like she'd landed on an alien planet. "This is what you've been doing?" she asked, watching us work. "This is what we've been building," I corrected, not stopping my work. "It's bigger than I expected." Tom looked up from his row of plants. "We're projecting $15,000 in revenue for our first season." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "15,000? From vegetables?" "Specialty vegetables, herbs, and flowers," I said, "sold directly to high-end restaurants and through farmers markets." "We already have contracts with 3 restaurants," Tom added, "and a waiting list at 2 farmers markets." I watched Sarah process this information. Her mother and father, whom she'd written off as having some kind of breakdown, were apparently building a viable business from scratch. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "You owe me respect," I replied. "The apology is just where it starts." By midsummer, our first harvest was exceeding every projection we'd made. The herbs especially were in such demand that we couldn't keep up. My basil was selling for 3 times what the grocery store charged for the wilted stuff shipped from California. The heirloom tomatoes had restaurants calling us directly, asking if we could increase production for next season. But the real transformation wasn't in the numbers. It was in the way Tom and I worked together, like partners instead of like a boss and an employee. He consulted me on business decisions. I consulted him on production planning. We disagreed sometimes, but we disagreed as equals. The ultimate test came in August, when Betty Crawford mentioned that the County Extension Office was looking for small farms to feature in their annual farm tour. It would mean opening our operation to the public, letting strangers judge what we'd built. "We should do it," Tom said that evening as we sat on the back porch, too tired to do anything but watch the sun set over our fields. "Are you sure we're ready?" "Are we ever going to be ready?" Sometimes you just have to trust that what you've built is worth showing off. The farm tour was scheduled for a Sunday in late August, the same weekend, almost exactly a year after the dinner that had changed everything. I spent the week before cleaning and organizing, setting up information displays, practicing what I would say to visitors. The night before the tour, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the ways it could go wrong. What if no one came? What if people came but weren't impressed? What if I forgot everything I'd learned and made a fool of myself in front of strangers? At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and walked out to the greenhouse. In the moonlight, I could see the neat rows of plants in various stages of growth, seedlings that would become fall crops, herbs hanging in bundles to dry, evidence everywhere of work that mattered, of dreams that had become reality. I thought about Rose and what she might say if she could see what I'd done with her land. I thought about the letters she'd written to my grandmother about believing you're worth the risk. Was I worth it? I whispered to the darkness. The answer came, from inside me, in my own voice, but with Rose's certainty. You're still becoming worth it. The next morning dawned clear and warm. By 10 o'clock, cars were parking along the road and people were walking through our gates. Families with children, elderly couples, young professionals interested in where their food came from. More people than I dared to hope for. I spent the day leading tours through the gardens, explaining our growing methods, sharing what I'd learned about soil health and organic pest control. Tom handled the business side, talking about markets and profit margins and the viability of small-scale farming. But the moment that mattered most came when a woman, about my age, stopped me near the herb garden. I have to ask, she said, how long have you been farming? This is our first year. Really? You seem so confident, so knowledgeable. I looked around at everything we'd built, at Tom explaining, irrigation systems to a group of teenagers, at visitors sampling our tomatoes and asking for recipes, at proof everywhere that dreams could become reality if you were willing to work for them. I guess I finally figured out what I was meant to do, I said. That evening, after the last visitor had left and we'd cleaned up the information tables, Tom and I sat on the porch with glasses of wine and watched the sun set over our fields. So, he said, what do you think? Was it worth it? I thought about the question seriously, about everything we'd risked and gained, about the marriage we'd almost lost and the partnership we'd found instead, about the woman I'd been a year ago and the person I was becoming. Ask me again next year, I said, when we know whether we can do it twice. Tom laughed. Fair enough. But for what it's worth, I'm proud of what we built here. What we built, I repeated. I like the sound of that. As darkness fell around us, I realized that this was what happiness felt like. Not the absence of problems or challenges, but the presence of purpose. The knowledge that your days matter, that your work has value, that you're becoming the person you were always meant to be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The fall harvest, planning for next year, the ongoing work of building a business and rebuilding a marriage. But tonight, sitting in the darkness surrounded by the smell of growing things, I knew I was exactly where I belonged. She doesn't do anything with her life, I said to the darkness, remembering Tom's words from a year ago. Who doesn't? Tom asked. The woman I used to be, I said. She's gone now. And in the comfortable silence that followed, I felt her go completely, finally, gratefully, forever.